They called him the richest man in 3 counties, but Gideon Marsh looked like he hadn't eaten a decent meal in weeks. Anyone who saw him would think the same thing. His clothes were a patchwork of faded denim and coarse burlap, stitched together with more hope than thread. His boots, worn straight through at the soles, spoke of endless miles walked to nowhere. And his hands, cracked and calloused from a decade of thankless labor, looked like 2 pieces of ancient, dried leather. Yet every single morning, without fail, he walked from his crumbling little house to the old wooden stable out back. And in his hands he carried a bucket filled with the finest, most expensive oats that money could possibly buy. Inside that stable, the reason for all of it stood silent and still. His name was Storm, a magnificent black stallion who hadn't taken a single step on his own in 10 long years. The horse's powerful frame, still rippling with the memory of muscle, was held upright by an elaborate cage of leather straps and wooden braces. Gideon had built the whole contraption with his own hands, piece by agonizing piece. Storm's eyes were sharp, intelligent, burning with a fire that refused to go out. But his legs just hung there, limp and useless. The townsfolk in Miller's Crossing had their own stories. They whispered that Gideon had snapped the day Dr. Ward delivered the final, terrible verdict. "He'll never walk again," the veterinarian had said, his voice heavy with the kind of certainty that comes from seeing too many broken things. He'd shaken his head, that slow, sad motion that seals a creature's fate. Most men would have reached for a rifle. A single shot would have ended the horse's suffering right then and there. It would have been the merciful thing to do. But Gideon had looked deep into Storm's dark, knowing eyes, and something in their depths had made him choose a different path. Now, 10 years later, a strange thing had happened. The same people who called him a fool behind his back had started calling him the millionaire of Miller's Crossing to his face. It was a joke at first, a cruel nickname for the crazy old man and his crippled horse. But then the rumors started to feel real. They'd come knocking on his door, these townsfolk, offering to buy acres of land he didn't seem to own. They'd beg him for investments he couldn't possibly make and ask for loans from a man who looked like he didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. What they didn't know, what nobody in the whole territory had figured out, was why. Why a man who lived like a pauper, who starved himself to feed his horse, was secretly the wealthiest person for hundreds of miles. And they definitely didn't know that the secret was tied to the very horse everyone said was worthless. The real answer, the impossible answer, lay in something Storm had been doing every single night for the past year. Something Gideon had seen with his own eyes but was too terrified to tell a single soul. Because he knew, deep in his bones, that they would never, ever believe him. The morning Gideon Marsh officially became a millionaire, nobody noticed. He was on his knees in the dim, dusty light of the stable, covered in horse manure and streaks of dried tears. He ran his weathered hands down Storm's motionless legs, the same ritual he'd performed every day for 10 years. That decade of desperate hope had carved deep lines into his face, mapping out a long, lonely road of sacrifice. But this morning felt different. This morning felt like the end. His last $20 sat folded in his coat pocket. It was a pitifully small amount, just enough to buy 1 more week of those expensive oats. After that, the money was gone, and Gideon would have to face the choice he'd been running from for 10 long years. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking as he pressed his forehead against Storm's powerful neck. The horse's breath was steady and warm, a comforting rhythm in the silent barn. But those legs, those beautiful, powerful legs, remained as useless as the day Dr. Ward had pronounced his sentence and walked away without a backward glance. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Gideon confessed to his only friend. Storm turned his magnificent head, his dark, intelligent eyes locking on to Gideon's. It was uncanny how the horse seemed to understand every word, every ounce of his pain. For 10 years, Storm had been his only companion, the one reason he got up in the morning. While the town laughed, Gideon had poured every penny, every drop of sweat into keeping this horse alive and comfortable. He'd sold off his father's land, piece by painful piece. He'd worked grueling double shifts at the lumber mill until his back screamed. He'd gone without meals more times than he could even remember, all for a horse that couldn't walk. A sharp knock at the stable door shattered his despair. Gideon hastily wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his sleeve and looked up. Mayor Curtis Briggs stood in the doorway, clutching his hat in his hands. His face, usually twisted into a condescending smirk whenever he saw Gideon, now held an expression that looked dangerously close to respect. "Gideon," the mayor said, and his voice was different. The usual mocking tone was gone, replaced by a strange kind of awe. "We need to talk. If you're here about the property taxes again, Curtis, I already told you I need another week." The mayor took a hesitant step into the stable, his eyes darting nervously toward Storm's inert form. "I'm not here about the taxes," he said, lowering his voice. "I'm here about the other matter, the business proposition we discussed last week." Gideon's brow furrowed in confusion. They hadn't discussed any business proposition. The mayor hadn't discussed anything with him in years, other than threats about overdue taxes. In fact, Curtis Briggs usually crossed the street just to avoid having to nod at him. "I think you've got me confused with someone else, Mayor." Mayor Briggs's eyes went wide, a flicker of panic in them. "Gideon, don't play games with me now. Not now. Half the territory is talking about your success. The railroad investors from the east, the big cattle barons up north. I've even heard folks from the Capitol are asking questions about the man from Miller's Crossing." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "How much are you really worth, Gideon? Just give me a number." Before Gideon could even begin to process the absurd question, a commotion erupted outside. Voices, lots of them, and the unmistakable sound of many horses approaching, fast. The mayor's face turned a sickly shade of pale as he peeked out the stable door. "Dear God," he breathed, his voice trembling. "They found out where you live." It was a nightmare. 6 men in expensive tailored suits were dismounting from their fine horses. They moved with the unshakable confidence of men who owned the world and expected it to welcome them. Gideon had never seen a single one of them before in his life, yet they walked toward his broken-down stable like they were old business partners arriving for a scheduled meeting. "Mr. Marsh," called the tallest of the group. He was a silver-haired man with a thick gold pocket watch chain gleaming across his vest. "Theodore Blackwood, from the Territorial Banking Consortium. We've been trying to reach you for weeks." Gideon's gaze flickered from the imposing banker to Mayor Briggs, who was now sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. "Reach me about what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your account, of course," Blackwood said with a polished, easy smile. He pulled a handsome leather portfolio from his saddlebag. "The transfers have been processed exactly as you requested. Though I must say, your method of communication is unconventional, to say the least." "What transfers?" Gideon's voice cracked. His world was tilting on its axis. Behind him, Storm shifted his weight. The leather harness creaked under the strain. It was the most significant movement the horse had made in months, a tiny shudder that sent a jolt of alarm through Gideon. Blackwood's smile faltered for just a second. He shot a quick, questioning glance at his companions, then turned his focus back to Gideon. "Sir," he said, his tone turning serious, "are you telling me you are not aware of the deposits, the investments, the vast land acquisitions made in your name over the past year?" Mayor Briggs stumbled forward, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Gideon, they're saying you've been making deals. Big ones, for months now." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Deals worth more money than this entire town sees in a decade." The banker, Blackwood, nodded gravely. "As of this morning's ledger, your holdings total just over $1.2 million. Mr. Marsh, you are, by a significant margin, one of the wealthiest men in the territory." Gideon's legs felt like they were about to give out from under him. He grabbed the rough wood of Storm's stall door for support, his mind a whirlwind of impossible numbers. $1 million. It couldn't be true. He had $20 to his name and a horse that couldn't stand on its own. He had been living on scraps and shattered hope for a decade. How could this be happening? "There's been some mistake," he managed to stammer. "A terrible mistake. I never made any deals. I don't have any investments. I don't have any money." "But the instructions came with your personal seal, sir," Blackwood insisted, his politeness wearing thin. Your signature. They even included specific private details that only you could possibly know. He opened the portfolio and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper, holding it up for Gideon to see. Like the fact, Blackwood read, his eyes cold and sharp, that you have been caring for a paralyzed stallion named Storm for exactly 10 years, 3 months, and 6 days. Gideon's blood turned to ice in his veins. Nobody knew those details. Nobody. He'd never told a single person the precise date of Storm's accident. It was a day seared into his memory, a private anniversary of loss he marked alone each year. He never ever spoke of it. Suddenly, Storm let out a sharp, urgent whinny. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of alarm. The horse's ears were pricked forward, his entire body alert in a way Gideon hadn't seen since before the fall. His gaze was fixed, locked on something behind the group of bankers, out past the stable door. Gideon slowly, hesitantly, followed the horse's intense stare, and his heart stopped beating in his chest. There, almost perfectly hidden in the deep shadow of the old oak tree at the edge of the property, stood a figure. It was a silhouette he recognized instantly, a shape from a past he thought was buried and gone forever. It was someone he had mourned, someone he had grieved, someone who was supposed to have been dead for 10 years. The figure stepped out of the shadows, and Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought they might break. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a memory. It was Marcus Flynn. He had been Gideon's best friend, his former business partner. The man everyone, including Gideon, believed had been crushed and buried in the mine collapse a decade ago. The very same day, the very same hour, that Storm had suffered his terrible injury. Marcus looked older, of course. His hair was silver now, and his face was a roadmap of hard years spent in hiding. But those sharp, intelligent green eyes were the same. Unmistakable. Marcus raised a single finger to his lips, a clear signal for silence. Then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he melted back into the trees and vanished. "Mr. Marsh?" Blackwood's voice sounded like it was coming from the other end of a long tunnel. "Are you feeling quite well, sir?" Gideon tore his eyes away from the spot where Marcus had stood and forced himself to look at the banker. His mind was racing, trying to connect a dozen impossible things at once. "Yes," he croaked, his throat dry as dust. "Yes, I'm fine. This is just a lot to take in." Marcus was alive. Marcus, who had always been a magician with numbers, who could predict the shifts in the market like he was reading tomorrow's newspaper. Marcus, who had supposedly died at the exact same moment his world had fallen apart. It couldn't be a coincidence. It was impossible. "Perhaps we could discuss the details of your portfolio inside," one of the other bankers suggested, stepping forward. "There are several new investment opportunities that require your immediate attention. Time is of the essence." "No," Gideon said, the word coming out sharper and stronger than he intended. "Not today. I need time to process this." Mayor Briggs scurried closer, his face a mask of frantic urgency. "Gideon, you can't just send these gentlemen away. They're offering you opportunities that could make you even wealthier. There's talk of a new railroad contract worth—" "I said no!" Gideon's voice boomed with a sudden authority that shocked everyone, including himself. He stood up straight, his eyes locking with Blackwood's. "Gentlemen, I appreciate you coming all this way. But before I sign anything or agree to anything, I need to verify these claims myself. Surely as bankers, you can understand the need for due diligence." Blackwood studied Gideon's face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Of course, Mr. Marsh. We understand completely. Though, as my colleague mentioned, time is a critical factor on several of these ventures." He reached into his portfolio and handed Gideon a thick, sealed envelope. "Your most recent transaction records. Review them at your leisure. We will be in touch." As the men in suits mounted their horses, preparing to leave, Storm whinnied again. It was that same urgent, piercing sound. But this time, the horse's head was turned not towards the oak tree, but toward the back of the stable, toward a small, sturdy door that led out to the empty pasture. For 10 years, that door had remained shut and bolted. What was the point of opening it for a horse that couldn't walk? But as Gideon's eyes fell upon it, a cold dread snaked its way up his spine. He noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The door was slightly ajar, and in the soft dirt around the threshold, there were fresh scratches, not the scuffs from his own worn-out boots. These were deeper, long, deliberate gouges in the earth, as if something heavy, impossibly heavy, had been dragged across the ground. Gideon waited until the sound of the banker's horses had completely faded into the distance. He stood frozen for a full 5 minutes, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Mayor Briggs had stammered a hasty goodbye and practically fled, leaving Gideon alone with the $1 million envelope and the 1,000 new questions that were screaming in his mind. Storm watched him, his eyes more alert and knowing than Gideon had seen them in a decade. Every tiny movement Gideon made, the horse tracked it. It was as if Storm knew exactly what was coming next and was waiting to see what Gideon would do. "What is it, boy?" Gideon whispered, his voice trembling as he walked toward the back of the stable. He reached for the heavy iron handle on the small pasture door, his own hand shaking so badly he could barely grasp it. He took a deep breath and pulled. The door swung open with a low groan, and what Gideon saw on the other side made his knees nearly buckle. There, in the soft, damp earth of the pasture, was a trail, a clear, undeniable trail of hoofprints. They led from the stable door straight across the field to the old oak tree where he had seen Marcus, and then they led right back again. But that was impossible, absolutely, utterly impossible. Storm hadn't taken a single step in 10 years. Gideon had been by his side day and night. He would have known. He had to have known. But the proof was right there, pressed into the mud, deep, perfect prints from the hooves of a large, heavy horse. His horse. Sleep was a luxury Gideon couldn't afford that night. He sat in the suffocating darkness of his small kitchen, the single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The envelope from Theodore Blackwood was spread across the rickety table, its contents spilling out like a treasure from another man's life. The documents were real. He could feel the weight of them, see the official seals. Bank statements showing staggering sums of money flowing in and out of an account with his name on it. Property deeds for vast tracts of land he'd never seen. Investment certificates for railroad shares and cattle futures. Everything bearing his name and his signature. But the handwriting wasn't his. Not even close. He stared at the elegant, confident loops and sharp angles of the script, and a chill went through him. He knew that handwriting. He'd seen it 1,000 times before, on business plans and contracts from a lifetime ago. It was Marcus Flynn's. Every single transaction, every brilliant business deal, every shrewd investment that had built this impossible, mysterious fortune over the past year had been orchestrated by his supposedly dead partner. But how? And more importantly, why now? Why, after 10 years of complete and total silence, had Marcus reappeared and made him a millionaire without his knowledge? A soft sound from the stable made Gideon freeze, his body going rigid. It was a sound he shouldn't have been able to hear. It was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the night, it was as loud as a gunshot. The creak of straining leather straps, the soft, deliberate shuffle of hooves on straw. He snatched the lantern from the table and crept out the back door, his bare feet silent on the cold, damp ground. The stable door was still slightly open, just as he'd left it hours ago. But as he got closer, he could hear it. Storm's breathing. It was different. It wasn't the shallow, tired breathing of a paralyzed animal at rest. It was the deep, steady, rhythmic breathing of a horse that had just been active, a horse that had been exerting itself. His hands shaking, Gideon pushed the stable door open just enough to peer inside, and the lantern nearly slipped from his grasp. Storm was standing. He was in the middle of his stall, completely untethered, the elaborate leather harness hanging empty against the wall. The stallion's powerful legs were trembling, not from weakness, but from the sheer effort of holding his own weight. But he was standing tall on all four legs, his magnificent head held high, his coat gleaming even in the dim lantern light. "Dear God," Gideon whispered, the words catching in his throat. Storm turned his head toward him, and in those deep, intelligent eyes, Gideon saw something he had never, ever noticed before. It wasn't just intelligence. It was guilt. The horse knew. He knew he'd been caught. Somehow, for months, maybe even longer, Storm had been walking. But only at night. Only when Gideon was asleep, exhausted from another day of backbreaking labor to care for him. "You've been sneaking out," Gideon said, his voice a choked whisper of disbelief and wonder. "You've been sneaking out at night, haven't you, boy?" That's how. That's how Marcus had done it. The pieces of the puzzle started slamming into place in Gideon's mind with dizzying speed. Marcus had survived the mine collapse, but for some reason, he couldn't show his face. Maybe he was in debt to dangerous men. Maybe he was wanted for a crime he didn't commit. So he'd gone into hiding, right here, living in the woods, watching from the shadows as Gideon struggled, as he sacrificed everything for Storm. And Storm, his brilliant, loyal, incredible Storm, had been healing, slowly, secretly. Those shattered leg bones had gradually, painfully, knitted themselves back together. Sheer willpower and careful, secret movements in the dead of night had done what the doctor said was impossible. The torn tendons and damaged muscles had been mending, month by painful month, strengthened by these secret nightly exercises. Dr. Ward hadn't known the whole story. The fractures, while severe, must have been clean breaks. With enough time, enough patience, enough care, they could mend. And Storm, with an animal intelligence that defied all logic, had kept his recovery a secret. He must have understood somehow that his paralysis was the only thing keeping Gideon there. His injury was Gideon's purpose, his reason for living. If Gideon knew he was better, he might leave. The love, the attention, the finest oats money could buy, it might all disappear. So every night, while Gideon slept the sleep of the exhausted, Storm would carefully slip out of his harness. He would meet Marcus in the pasture under the cover of darkness, and together the man who was supposed to be dead and the horse that was supposed to be crippled had been conducting business. Storm was the messenger. It was the perfect cover. Who would ever suspect a paralyzed horse of carrying secret messages, coded signals, and signed documents to and from Marcus's contacts across the territory? An animal that couldn't move was the ultimate secret agent, hiding in plain sight. A sudden rustling in the hayloft made both Gideon and Storm whip their heads around. A figure dropped down from the shadows, landing silently on the straw-covered floor. Marcus Flynn stepped into the lantern light, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Before you say anything, Gideon," Marcus said, his voice quiet and strained, "let me explain. I never meant for it to go on this long, I swear. I was going to tell you everything, just as soon as we'd made enough to secure your future for good." But his explanation was cut short by a new sound from outside, the thunder of approaching riders, many of them, and they were coming fast, with a grim and terrible purpose. Storm's ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Marcus's face went white with pure, undiluted terror. "They found me," Marcus whispered, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at Gideon, a decade of regret and desperation in his gaze. "Gideon, whatever happens next, remember that everything I did, everything we did, it was for you." But Gideon wasn't listening. He pushed Marcus aside, his movements swift and sure. He grabbed Storm's bridle from its hook on the wall and secured it around the stallion's head with steady, practiced hands. He looked from his friend to his horse, a fierce determination hardening his face. "If we're doing this," Gideon said, his voice low and steady, "we're doing it right." The stable door didn't just open. It exploded inwards, torn from its hinges by a heavy boot. Three menacing figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the moonlight, rifles held at the ready. They kicked open the door just as Marcus, spurred by Gideon's urgency, swung himself onto Storm's broad back. For one terrifying, frozen moment, everyone stopped. The air crackled with tension. The bounty hunters stood in shocked disbelief, their brains struggling to process the image of a man mounted on a horse they'd been told was a worthless cripple. Marcus sat frozen atop the stallion, terrified that Storm's newly healed legs might buckle under the sudden weight. And Gideon stood beside them, his hand on Storm's neck, praying that a decade of love and a year of secret healing had been enough. Storm took one hesitant step, then another. his legs held firm, bunching with power. Son of a... The lead bounty hunter began to curse, his face contorting with rage and confusion. But his words were swallowed by the sudden eruption of motion. Storm didn't just walk or trot. He didn't just run. He exploded from that stable like a black thunderbolt unleashed from a cage. His powerful muscles, held in check for 10 long years, were finally free to show the world what a decade of patient, silent healing had truly accomplished. Marcus clung tight to the reins, his knuckles white, as Storm soared over the splintered remains of the stable door. He then cleared the pasture fence in a magnificent, impossible leap, a feat that would have been unthinkable for any ordinary horse, let alone one that was supposedly paralyzed just moments before. "Get him! Ride them down!" the lead bounty hunter bellowed, snapping out of his shock. His men scrambled for their mounts, their surprise turning to furious determination. Gideon watched in breathless amazement as Storm carried Marcus across the moonlit pasture with a fluid, powerful grace. This wasn't the shaky, hesitant movement of a recently healed animal. This was a horse in its absolute prime, a horse in perfect, flawless condition, perhaps even stronger than he'd been before the accident. All those secret nights of exercise, of building strength in the darkness, had forged Storm into something truly extraordinary. But the bounty hunters were professionals. They were experienced trackers, and their horses were fresh and fast. They fanned out across the field, a deadly web spreading out to cut off Marcus's escape routes. They were deliberately forcing him away from the open plains and toward the treacherous, rocky ground near Devil's Canyon, a place where even the most sure-footed horse could easily stumble, break a leg, and fall. It was a trap, and Marcus was riding straight into it. "This way," Gideon roared, his voice cutting through the night. He started running alongside the fence line, his worn boots pounding against the earth. He knew these lands better than any stranger, every rock, every ditch, every hidden path. "The old mining road. To your left." Marcus heard him. He wheeled Storm around, veering sharply toward a narrow, barely visible path that wound its way up between the dark, imposing hills. It was a dangerous route, littered with loose stones and hidden sinkholes from the old collapsed tunnels. But it was also a shortcut, the fastest possible way to the main road, where Marcus might find help, or at least a chance to disappear. Storm navigated the treacherous path with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. But it wasn't magic. It was pure intelligence, incredible sure-footedness, and the deep, unspoken trust between horse and rider that had been forged in a year of secret nighttime ventures. The bounty hunters spurred their horses in pursuit, trying to follow them up the narrow track. But their mounts weren't familiar with the broken terrain. One horse stumbled on the loose shale, sending its rider tumbling head over heels into the dust. Another balked at a particularly steep, crumbling section, refusing to go any further and costing them precious seconds. As Marcus and Storm crested the last hill and disappeared from view, the lead bounty hunter reined in his horse. He turned, his face a mask of cold fury, and fixed his gaze on Gideon. "Where is he going?" he snarled, dismounting and striding toward him. "I don't know," Gideon said, and it was the honest truth. Marcus could be heading anywhere. The capital, the new railroad depot. He has contacts everywhere. He could be planning to disappear forever. The bounty hunter studied Gideon's face for a long, hard moment, searching for any hint of a lie. Then he gave a slow, chilling nod. "Maybe you don't know," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "But you're going to help us find him anyway." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded legal document. He thrust it at Gideon. "This is a lien," the man said, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction, "against all property and assets belonging to Marcus Flynn and his known associates. That includes you, partner." He leaned in close, his breath hot and foul. "Unless Flynn pays the $50,000 he owes within 7 days, we'll be taking everything. Your land, your house, your horse, and every single penny of that new fortune he built in your name." Gideon's heart plummeted. Even if Marcus had escaped, they were still trapped. The money was legally his, but these men had the power, the legal right to take it all away. Unless he could come up with an impossible amount of money in just 7 days. After the bounty hunters rode off, leaving their threat hanging in the cold night air, Gideon stumbled back to his kitchen. He collapsed into the chair, staring at the legal document on the table. A lien. $50,000. It was a king's ransom. To most people, it was an insurmountable fortune. To him, it was less than a tenth of the money Marcus had supposedly made in his name. But there was a problem, a huge one. He'd spent the rest of the night poring over the papers from Blackwood's envelope. The vast majority of the million-dollar fortune wasn't cash. It was all tied up in long-term investments. Land that would take months to sell, railroad bonds that wouldn't mature for years, complex cattle futures that couldn't be liquidated on a whim. Getting his hands on $50,000 in cash in just 1 week was just as impossible as it had been yesterday. He was a millionaire on paper and a pauper in reality. A soft, gentle whinny from outside drew him to the window. In the pale light of dawn, Storm was standing at the pasture gate. He was no longer hunched or hiding, no longer pretending to be helpless. He stood tall and proud, his magnificent coat gleaming in the morning sun. His powerful bearing showed the world what Gideon had always known in his heart. This horse was something extraordinary, and that's when the idea struck him. It was a lightning bolt, a desperate, brilliant spark in the darkness of his despair. Gideon ran to the stable. He went to an old dusty tack box in the corner, a box he hadn't opened in years. He threw open the lid and dug frantically through old leather straps and rusted tools until his fingers found it. A small oilskin-wrapped packet. Inside were Storm's papers, breeding certificates, bloodline records going back generations, and one crucial document he had completely forgotten about, a paper that had been meaningless for 10 long years. Storm wasn't just any horse. He was a direct descendant of Thunderbolt, the legendary racehorse from the East, a champion whose offspring were so rare and so prized that wealthy buyers from across the country paid astronomical prices for them. For a decade, everyone, including Gideon, had assumed Storm was worthless, a tragic end to a magnificent bloodline. But now that Storm could not only walk, but run like the wind itself, his value had just increased 1,000-fold. By evening, the word was out. Gideon had sent messages with the stable boy from the next farm over, who rode like the devil was chasing him. The notes went to every major horse breeder, every wealthy ranch owner, every serious collector within a 100-mile radius. The message was simple, and it was shocking. Storm, the supposedly paralyzed son of the legendary Thunderbolt, had made a miraculous, complete recovery, and he was now available for stud services. The response was not just immediate, it was overwhelming. The first to arrive was Carson Vale, the territory's richest and most ruthless cattle baron. He thundered up the next morning in a cloud of dust, a heavy wagon full of armed guards trailing behind him. On the wagon were 3 heavy, locked chests. "Name your price, Marsh," Vale boomed without even a hello. He gestured to the wagon. "That's gold, real gold. I'll pay anything for the exclusive breeding rights to that stallion." Before Gideon could even form a reply, 2 more fine carriages pulled up the lane, followed by another and another. Word had spread through the tight-knit racing community like a wildfire. A horse with Storm's perfect bloodline, a genetic miracle believed to be lost forever, was suddenly, impossibly available again. This was more than just a horse. It was a chance to own a piece of history, to breed a new generation of champions. 50,000, a sharp voice announced. It was Elizabeth Harrington, the formidable steel heiress from the capital, her face framed by an expensive feathered hat. 50,000 for exclusive breeding rights for 1 full year. 75, countered Carson Vale immediately, his eyes flashing with competitive fire. 100,000, declared Judge Morrison, a man who traveled all night from the territorial courthouse, his face weary, but his eyes gleaming with ambition. Gideon listened in stunned silence as the price climbed higher and higher. 120,000, 150,000. These people weren't just buying breeding rights anymore. They were investing in the very future of horse racing in the territory. A foal from Storm would be worth a fortune itself, and every single one of these wealthy, powerful people wanted to be the one to own it. But the highest bid, the one that silenced the entire crowd, came from a very unexpected source. Theodore Blackwood, the banker, stepped forward from his carriage, a sleek leather satchel in his hand. He looked calm and composed amidst the frenzy. "Mr. Marsh," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the murmuring crowd, "my consortium has been discussing your unique situation. We are prepared to offer you $200,000 in cash today." He paused for effect, letting the staggering number sink in. "Plus," he added smoothly, "a permanent contract guaranteeing that all of Storm's offspring will be sold exclusively through our banking network. You will receive 60% of all profits from any and all future sales. In perpetuity." The crowd fell dead silent. It was an unbelievable offer. $200,000 in cash was more than enough to pay off Marcus's supposed debt 4 times over, with a fortune left to secure Gideon's future forever. And the ongoing contract, it would make him wealthy for the rest of his life. Generations of his family would be rich. Storm, as if he understood exactly what was happening, pranced proudly in the pasture behind the fence. He showed off the raw strength and impossible grace that had been hidden from the world for so long. After a decade of being pitied, of being seen as a broken, worthless animal, Storm was finally getting the recognition he so richly deserved. But just as Gideon was about to accept Blackwood's incredible offer, another rider appeared, galloping down the road at a breakneck pace. Gideon's heart leaped into his throat when he recognized him. It was Marcus Flynn. He rode up on a borrowed horse, his face not filled with fear, but shining with triumph and hope. And riding right behind him were Sheriff Coleman and 2 uniformed federal marshals. Their expressions were not threatening. They were grimly professional. "Gideon!" Marcus called out, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped. "You're not going to believe this. The bounty hunters, they weren't real bounty hunters. They were wanted men themselves." He was breathless, his words tumbling out in a rush. "When I reached the next town and told my story, the marshals recognized their descriptions immediately. They arrested the whole gang this morning for extortion, fraud, and a dozen other crimes across 3 territories. Their lien against you is worthless. It's all fake." The crowd of wealthy buyers murmured in confusion, but a profound wave of relief washed over Gideon. He was free. The threat was gone. Even so, he turned his gaze to Theodore Blackwood and gave a firm, clear nod. "I accept your offer." Blackwood's polite smile never wavered. He opened his satchel, revealing stacks of crisp banknotes and heavy bags of gold coin. More money than Gideon had ever seen in one place. $200,000 as promised, the banker said smoothly, "and the contract for Storm's ongoing services. A pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Marsh." Marcus stared, his mouth agape in amazement. "Gideon, what did you do?" Gideon walked over to the fence and stroked Storm's powerful neck, the horse nuzzling against his chest. "I did what you and Storm taught me, Marcus," he replied, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I finally learned to see the true value of what I had all along." Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat, stepping forward. "There's more good news, Marsh," he said, holding out a file of papers. "We've been looking into those investments Flynn made in your name. With the help of the federal authorities, we've confirmed they're all legitimate and incredibly profitable. The railroad contract alone is set to pay out dividends for the next 20 years. He looked at Gideon with a newfound respect. "Son, you're not just the richest man in the county. You're looking at being one of the wealthiest men in 3 territories." Storm let out a proud, happy whinny and nudged Gideon's shoulder. After 10 long years of being seen as a burden, of being defined by his injury, the magnificent stallion was finally being recognized for what he truly was. Not just a horse, but a partner, a friend, and now the foundation of a business empire. As the buyers slowly dispersed and contracts were officially signed with the local magistrate, Marcus pulled Gideon aside, his eyes still wide with disbelief. "I have to ask you, Gideon, be honest. How long did you know? How long have you known that Storm could walk?" Gideon looked at his old friend, the man he thought he had lost forever, and he smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. "I didn't know for certain until yesterday," he admitted, "but I always suspected. Deep down." He looked out at Storm, grazing contentedly in the pasture, a free and whole animal. Sometimes, late at night, I'd watch him sleep, and I'd catch him shifting his weight, moving in ways that should have been impossible for a paralyzed horse. And his muscles, they never atrophied. A crippled horse's muscles waste away to nothing. His never did. They stayed strong. Gideon paused, his voice growing quiet. And his eyes, he said softly, his eyes always held too much intelligence, too much spirit for a broken animal. He never looked defeated. Then why didn't you ever test him? Marcus asked, his voice filled with wonder. Why didn't you try to make him stand? Because somewhere along the way, I realized something more important, Gideon said, his gaze fixed on the magnificent horse. It didn't matter to me whether he could walk or not. I was never going to give up on him. I loved him either way. He took a deep breath, the truth of the words settling in his soul. And maybe, just maybe, he understood that. Maybe that's why he finally got better. Because he knew he was safe. He knew he could heal at his own pace, without any pressure, because my love for him wasn't conditional on him being whole. Marcus nodded slowly, the pieces finally clicking into place for him as well. And maybe, he added, that's why he trusted me enough to help. He knew that anyone you cared about that much had to be worth helping. As the sun began to set over Miller's Crossing, casting long golden rays across the land, Gideon stood with his two most trusted companions. His oldest friend returned from the dead, and the horse that had saved them both. Dr. Ward had been wrong about the permanence of Storm's condition, but he hadn't been wrong about its severity. The complex fractures, the torn tendons, the massive trauma, it had all been real, and it had been devastating. But time, patience, and the unbreakable spirit of a magnificent horse had proven that even the most dire predictions can sometimes be overcome. Storm would never just walk again. He had run. He had run straight into a fortune that would last for generations. The veterinarian's grim pronouncement, the words that had once sounded like a death sentence, had accidentally become the foundation for the greatest success story the territory had ever seen. Sometimes the most devastating predictions become the most beautiful lies. And sometimes the greatest fortunes are built on nothing more than the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on the things you love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected. And if you have a story about a time when loyalty and hope paid off in a big way, share it with us down in the comments below. We'd love to hear it.